Welcome back to Boy Party's 25 for 25, where I count down the 25 best films of the century so far. This week I'm discussing 2001's Spirited Away, Hayao Miyazaki's Japanese animated masterpiece, the best Studio Ghibli film, in my opinion, and I think somewhat objectively, and the film on this list that I've probably been the most intimidated to talk about, because by its very definition, I think this film is really hard to discuss, put into words, what have you. I think it's so incredibly visual in its language and in its storytelling that to try and talk about it without just describing a series of weird and compelling images is to do it a disservice, which is about what I'm about to do. This film was released in 2001, and many people have discussed how in many ways it sort of sparked a new era of not only Japanese animation being welcomed by international audiences and an American audience particularly, but foreign language film in general succeeding in the United States and in Hollywood. And this film winning the Best Animated Feature Oscar at the 75th Oscars was a major turning point in terms of having a mainstream acceptance of a film made in a foreign language and in an entirely different culture. I mean, this film is so specifically and distinctly Japanese. There are so many references in this film to Japanese history and folklore and fairy tales that I am completely oblivious to, I imagine, and that most Westerners are probably completely oblivious to. But what they do create is this incredibly, three-dimensional, fully rounded visual space for our characters to operate in. And what this film does that I think basically no other animated film has ever achieved is it creates this environment where you feel like there are things happening on the edges of the frame and beyond. You know, you're looking at this illustrated image. You know, it could be out of a picture book, but it feels like, based on the sound design and the way that characters and creatures and whatever move in and out of the frame, you feel as though there is a whole world happening just outside the frame, behind you, everywhere. It's completely immersive. It's completely three-dimensional. It's quite extraordinary. And I think it changed a lot of people's perspectives about how cinema from another culture and another language could be engaging and immersive. I think a very wide, broad audience saw this film when it was released, including adults and children. And I think that it has led to not only a sort of massive following for Miyazaki's cinema and the style of animation that he is known for. And you've seen that in unfortunate ways, such as the horrible AI trend last year where people were turning their photographs into Studio Ghibli style using an AI tool. It was really unfortunate. It took all of the art and creativity out of this style of animation. But what it did speak to was the fact that the mainstream, the sorts of people in the world who enjoy using AI image editing tools have seen films by Miyazaki and by the studio, and they love them, and they have a pretty deep relationship with them, and that's pretty extraordinary for films that are this peculiar by traditional Hollywood standards. Spirited Away is definitely the top of the heap, I think, in terms of sort of adoration and acceptance as a sort of zeitgeisty, stone cold pantheon movie. I think any 25 for 25 list of the 21st century so far that does not include Spirited Away would be severely lacking. So although I've only seen this film twice myself to date, and I came to it quite late in life, I did think there was no way this list was going to be released without this film included on it. So I only saw this film for the first time in 2019. I have a funny relationship with Miyazaki and Ghibli, whereby I was growing up in the 2000s, and I was pretty much the right age to see this. I mean, I was only 4 when it was released, but I would have been able to see it a few years after that. But there was no real interest in Japanese animation in my home. I think there was maybe an unfortunate lack of understanding of the difference between, anime with, violence and fighting and superheroics, and the really artful films that Ghibli were putting out. So I was not shown these films when I was young, but I was well aware of them, and the imagery of Spirited Away was so omnipresent throughout the 2000s. It was obviously being treated as this incredible film, and you would see the poster and the main image of Chihiro, alongside movies like The Incredibles and Fantastic Mr. Fox and WALL-E, which was of course included on this list as one of the great animated films of the century. So I knew I would eventually get around to it, I think. And in 2019, a friend of mine introduced me to this film, kind of pointing out to me that it had a lot of stuff in it I would find really interesting to do with dreams and space and fantastical environments, and they were absolutely correct. I remember a cold night in September watching about half of this film in my friend's house, and then needing to get the last bus home. And the second I got home, watching the second half on my own and feeling like a bit of a crazy person having watched this film with a bus journey in between, and having seen half of it in the company of another person and then seeing half of it on my own. I don't know, in some way kind of reflected the weird isolation that this film captures. But I hadn't watched it again until the other day when I revisited it ahead of doing this. But when The Boy and the Heron was released in late 2023, I was very excited to see it, because at that point I had fully embraced Miyazaki as a master, and I thought The Boy and the Heron was fabulous and was definitely one of my favorite Miyazaki films, although not quite as great as Spirited Away. But I think what this film captures, which is really special, and this is where I want to specifically speak to my own experience, is only child anxiety and the fear of a world without your parents when that is the extent of your family, right? So Coraline, the Neil Gaiman book, and its subsequent film that Laika put out, the Henry Selick movie, is another really good example of an only child story. There's a number of others, obviously, but you're talking Inside Out is a great one, but you're talking about a version of the world where, as a child, your entire world is your parents. If you don't have siblings, I think your sense of family is very much concentrated on these two people, and obviously in many people's cases, a single parent. But in my case, it was two parents and myself, and the greatest fear you have is that something will happen to both of them and you'll be left on your own, because you don't have siblings to guide you through the world in that case, right? And this film starts with the parents being sort of lured with Chihiro into this abandoned theme park, and she wanders off, and when she comes back, her parents have been turned into pigs. This scene is absolutely terrifying, obviously, but also triggers this really palpable sense of fear that my parents are no longer people I can look for comfort from and communicate with at all, because they are now greedy pigs. So Chihiro sets off on this adventure into a world which is somewhere between Alice in Wonderland and, as I said, a lot of Japanese folklore. There's elements of lots of fairy tales incorporated. I think in many ways the fantasy world of this film sets audiences up for something like Avatar, although this is obviously a lot more vividly realized, I think, although I do like those films as well. But it's just the most colorful, vibrant, dynamic world. There's weird, crazy creatures with really unique designs popping up into frame every minute, every second. It is such an incredibly fully fleshed out world on screen, and there's really nothing more I can say about it than like you get sucked into everything that's going on in the background, the detail, and how Chihiro is being affected by all of this in such a profound way that I think very few films, especially films aimed at sort of young audiences, have ever managed to capture. In terms of the narrative, I'm not going to bore you with a long-winded explanation, but this film explores elements of the sort of world of labor and lots of other things. She ends up working at a bathhouse once she sort of leaves her parents behind and goes to venture into this world. Yubaba is the name of this old grandmotherly figure who is her boss, and Yubaba is probably my favorite character in the film in terms of design. ここで働かせてください。
バカなおしゃべりはやめとくれ。そんなひょろひょろに何ができるの?
And there's a young, handsome boy she befriends called Haku, who ultimately turns out to be a river, but he's also a phoenix, I think. Everything is everything in this film. Anything can be multiple things at once because it is dream logic. And in dream logic, things transform without reason and without warning. And that's what this film is operating on. It's operating on dream logic. And this is something that the work of David Lynch does really well, and we'll obviously get to Lynch later on this list, but like the idea that cinema doesn't need to depict things in an entirely realistic way, and that things can transform and be perceived as different things is so rare and so special, and makes you feel like you're dreaming when you're watching it, which is a really special feeling. The best scene in this film, I think, and maybe the most iconic image in this film, is when Chihiro and No Face, who is an incredibly beautifully designed creature, end up on this train together. And this is when the really palpable sense of mortality and of the bridge between the living and the dead comes into play. And the music, I must say, the score of this film by Joe Hisayashi, who has actually got a score out this week for the new film, A Big Bold Beautiful Journey, which we'll be discussing on the podcast. But the score adds so much atmosphere to this film, and in this scene in particular, it really flourishes.
おいで。おとなしくしててね。
And, ultimately for such a kind of disturbing film with such a weird, moody tone, it does end on a happy ending. As Chihiro gets back to her parents, they turn back to human beings, and they continue on with their move. And I should say that they're moving house in this film, and that moving house a lot as a child is also something that I experienced, and I think I connect to in this. And the weird, uncanny valley of when you're moving home, I think, is part of the feeling in this film that it provokes, that is really, really powerful. So I don't think I've said anything particularly original or profound about this film, but I think you just have to take my word for it. If you haven't seen Spirited Away, please check it out. Extraordinary piece of work. Miyazaki is one of the great filmmakers of the century. He's still going strong. He is 84 years old, and apparently he's working on another project now. I hope that comes to fruition, because he's still got it, as The Boy and the Heron demonstrated. But please tune in soon for the next edition of the 25 for 25, and regular episodes of Boy Party drop every Tuesday at boypartypod.com. Bye bye.
オーライオーライ、平気よ。
千尋、行くよ。
千尋、早くしなさい。